He who seeks to be loved by all will soon discover he belongs to none. But he who dares to stand alone will find that respect follows where approval once ruled.
Do you really think you were chosen or merely accepted? Do you believe you're in control or just reacting to what she allows? And when she says she likes you, do you hear desire or convenient validation? Most men don't lose women, they lose position. And the problem doesn't begin with betrayal, coldness, or rejection. It begins with ignorance. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince, "Men in general judge more by their eyes than by their hands, because everyone can see, but few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you truly are." He was speaking about political power, but he could just as easily have been describing intimate relationships. Because where there is emotion, there is strategy. Where there is desire, there is hierarchy. And where there is weakness, someone inevitably fills the space. This isn't about romanticizing anything. It's about psychological mechanics. Do you really think she changed out of nowhere? That the sideways comment was impulsive? That the sudden distance was just an emotional coincidence? Weak men interpret signals as accidents. Intelligent women use signals as instruments. The test is never announced. It's provoked, a calculated delay, a compliment that compares you to another man. A subtly disrespectful comment disguised as a joke, a silence that lingers longer than usual. It's not drama, it's measurement. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote, "It is necessary for a prince to know well how to use the nature of the beast and the man." In relationships, that line is still alive, because human behavior isn't guided only by affection, it's guided by the reading of strength. The silent test serves one single question. Is he emotionally stable, or does he depend on me? And here's the point most men can't stand facing. A weak man doesn't fail the test because he's sensitive. He fails because he's hungry for validation. When she provokes, he explains. When she pulls away, he chases. When she uses irony, he justifies himself. When she cools down, he intensifies. Every reaction reveals hierarchical anxiety. He's not responding to her behavior. He's responding to the fear of losing access. And access, for the weak man, is synonymous with value. She observes. She doesn't need to argue. She only needs to provoke just enough to see if you collapse. Because whoever loses emotional center under light pressure will lose it under real pressure. Here's a point popular psychology avoids saying: respect precedes desire. Not moral respect, structural respect. The kind that arises when someone realizes you are not easily displaced. The silent test doesn't seek perfection. It seeks stability. But the weak man interprets it as a personal attack. He thinks, she's being unfair. She's disrespecting me. She's playing games. Maybe she is. But the real question isn't about her intention. It's about your reaction. Because the test only works if there's something to shake. There's a brutal difference between sensitivity and instability. Sensitivity perceives movement. Instability reacts to movement. An excessive reaction is the signature of emotional dependence. When you rush to correct her perception, you communicate fear. When you feel the need to verbally reaffirm your value, you communicate insecurity. When you try to quickly restore harmony, you communicate neediness. And neediness in power dynamics is exposed fragility. This isn't about becoming stone. It's about not surrendering your axis. A woman who tests isn't necessarily consciously manipulating. Often it's instinctive. She wants to know, if I tighten the rope, does he snap? And weak men always snap. Or they explode, or they beg, or they dramatize, or they rationalize, but they rarely remain unshaken. And unshaken doesn't mean cold. It means centered. There's a difference. The centered man hears the provocative comment and doesn't react defensively. He notices the distance and doesn't beg for closeness. He perceives the test and doesn't announce that he noticed, because announcing that you noticed is already a sign you were affected. Here's what few admit. Many relationships don't end for lack of love, but for excess insecurity revealed. The silent test accelerates the inevitable. If you depend on her approval to feel sufficient, she will know. And when she knows, your position changes, not out of malice, but out of perception. In any social structure, whoever depends more invests more. Whoever invests more risks more. Whoever risks more fears more. And whoever fears more loses strength. The silent test doesn't create weakness. It reveals it. And revelation is rarely comfortable. The question isn't whether she tests. The question is, what exactly in you can be shaken when she decides to apply pressure? Because as long as you keep reacting like someone afraid to lose, you are already in the inferior position, and no one deeply respects what can be easily destabilized. You think you're in love, but have you stopped to analyze why you think about her precisely when she pulls away? Why does her interest increase when you start to detach? And why does yours increase when she begins to cool off? This isn't destiny, it's neurobiology applied to power dynamics. Predictable reward creates stability. Unpredictable reward creates addiction. Intermittent validation is one of the oldest and most effective psychological conditioning tools in human behavior. Casinos use it. Social media platforms use it. Relationships use it too. She responds intensely today, takes hours tomorrow. Compliments you in one moment, acts indifferent in the next. The weak man interprets this as emotional mystery, but what's happening is variable reinforcement. The brain doesn't become addicted to constant presence. It becomes addicted to uncertainty. When you don't know whether you'll receive approval, your nervous system goes on alert. You begin investing more energy, more attention, more effort. You start trying to earn something that was once spontaneous. And here's the uncomfortable part. The more you try to regain validation, the more you communicate that you need it. And perceived need lowers perceived value. The woman who alternates proximity and distance doesn't need to explain anything. Silence itself creates tension. The weak man responds to tension by trying to restore balance. He sends a message. He starts a conversation. He offers more attention. He gives more than he receives. From that moment on, the dynamic has already shifted, because the one who seeks validation invests. The one who controls validation sets the pace. This isn't romantic theory, it's emotional economics. The principle is simple. What is scarce gains weight. What is guaranteed loses impact. If your attention is unlimited, it loses strategic value. If your presence is always available, it stops being perceived as a choice. It becomes an implicit obligation. An obligation rarely sustains desire. Intermittent validation creates a psychological oscillation. hope to doubt, to relief, to euphoria, to new doubt. This cycle is powerful because it activates fear of loss before loss even happens. You start thinking, what did I do? Did I say something wrong? Why did she change? And by doing that, you shift your focus away from your own center and toward her behavior. You begin adjusting your tone, adjusting your posture, adjusting your intensity. And each adjustment communicates something invisible. You're reacting. The problem isn't that she alternates her behavior. The problem is that you allow that alternation to redefine your internal state. There's a subtle point here. Not every oscillation is conscious manipulation, but every oscillation creates an opportunity for testing. If you become unstable when the other person becomes unpredictable, you've already revealed emotional dependence. Intermittent validation only works fully on someone who lacks consolidated internal validation. The centered man notices the oscillation and doesn't change his foundation. The weak man feels the oscillation and momentarily changes his identity. An unstable identity doesn't inspire deep respect. Have you noticed how some men don't seem affected when female attention decreases? It's not that they don't feel it. It's that they don't negotiate their value. They don't intensify. They don't beg. They don't compete with imaginary ghosts. They observe. And observing is holding position. Now understand the final point of this law. Whoever controls predictability controls attachment. If your presence is guaranteed, regardless of how you're treated, you're offering unconditional security without requiring structural reciprocity. That may look like maturity, but often it's just fear of loss. Intermittent validation reveals who can tolerate uncertainty without becoming disorganized. Because healthy desire doesn't arise from anxiety. Anxiety arises from perceived emotional scarcity. And when you begin acting from scarcity, your decisions stop being strategic. They become reactive. Reactivity is visible weakness. The uncomfortable question isn't, is she doing this on purpose? The question is, why does her oscillation alter your internal state so much? If a few days of distance are enough to make you doubt your own value, the problem isn't her strategy. It's your silent dependence on confirmation. And as long as your stability depends on her behavior, she will continue, consciously or not, setting the rhythm of the game. Do you believe that when she opens up emotionally, she's giving away power? Or have you never considered that by revealing fragility, someone may actually be assuming invisible control? There's a brutal difference between genuine vulnerability and functional vulnerability. Genuine vulnerability exposes without calculation. Functional vulnerability selects what to expose. When a woman shares traumas, insecurities, or deep pain, the weak man interprets it as absolute trust. He feels chosen as a safe harbor. He feels special. But there's a more complex psychological layer unfolding. By revealing pain, she creates a bond. By creating a bond, she creates responsibility. By creating responsibility, she shifts the power dynamic. The weak man reacts like this. Now I need to prove I'm different. I need to take care of her. I can't fail. He steps into the savior role, and the savior role is an inferior position disguised as nobility. Because the one who needs to save is trying to validate his own importance. Strategic vulnerability creates an emotional anchor. you start measuring your actions by the impact they might have on her fragility. You avoid confrontation, avoid setting boundaries, avoid disappearing, avoid disagreeing, not out of maturity, but out of fear of hurting someone who has shown herself as broken. And here is the silent inversion. Whoever controls the narrative of their own pain controls the other person's behavior. This isn't about pretending. The pain may be real, but its exposure is never neutral. Every deep revelation alters the psychological structure of a relationship. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Exposed vulnerability activates archetypes: the caregiver, the protector, the redeemer. If you don't recognize this happening, you step into the role automatically, and roles assumed unconsciously are difficult to abandon later. The weak man begins investing emotionally, not for who she is now, but for who he believes he can help her become. He becomes attached to the mission. But an emotional mission is a trap when it isn't reciprocal, because while he is focused on protecting her fragility, who is protecting his structure? There is another point almost no one admits. When someone reveals vulnerability too early, it accelerates artificial intimacy. You feel intense closeness in a short time, but accelerated closeness is not depth, it's controlled exposure. And exposure creates the illusion of deep connection. The weak man interprets emotional intensity as destiny, but often it's just selective openness. Strategic vulnerability also functions as shielding. If you question behavior, she can reactivate past pain. If you set a boundary, she can associate it with previous abandonment. Without realizing it, you begin walking carefully. And excessive carefulness generates self-censorship. Self-censorship is progressive submission, not because you were forced, but because you chose to preserve her fragility above your position. Here is the central point. Empathy without structure becomes exploitable weakness. You can be understanding, but if your understanding eliminates your firmness, you've already left your center. Strategic vulnerability tests something different from Law 1. It doesn't test your impulsive reaction. It tests your ability to maintain boundaries even in the presence of someone else's fragility. And few can, because saying no to someone who has shared pain activates guilt. And guilt is one of the most silent control tools that exist. The weak man begins thinking, after everything she's been through, I can't be another mistake. I need to be better. But this constant need to prove value keeps you trapped. You stop acting by choice. You start acting out of emotional obligation. And emotional obligation destroys attraction, because attraction requires choice, not psychological debt. Strategic vulnerability isn't about manipulation. It's about observing whether you lose structure when fragility enters the equation. If you sacrifice your boundaries to maintain the protector role, you're not leading the dynamic, you're serving it. The uncomfortable question isn't, did she do this on purpose? The question is, can you hold your position even when someone places pain on the table? Because if your firmness collapses in the face of tears, your structure was never firm. And whoever realizes that first rarely sees you the same way again. Have you noticed how some women seem to become more desirable when they grow more distant? And how some men internally collapse when access decreases? Withdrawal is not absence, it's a tool. When a woman reduces contact, replies less, shows mild indifference after moments of intensity, something specific happens in the male brain. Activation of loss threat. And loss threat activates urgency. Urgency destroys composure. The weak man interprets withdrawal as a sign he must act quickly so he doesn't lose ground. He sends more messages, tries to schedule meetings, increases compliments, offers emotional reassurance no one asked for. He doesn't realize that by doing this, he's negotiating his own position. Withdrawal works because it creates contrast. Before, there was constant presence. Now there is silence. Before, there was intensity. Now there is neutrality. The brain hates losing a positive pattern, and it will do almost anything to restore it. This is where the dynamic resets. Whoever tolerates silence better controls the rhythm. Whoever becomes destabilized by it gives away power. Calculated silence is not necessarily conscious manipulation, but it is behavioral reading. If at the first sign of distance you enter compensation mode, you've revealed dependence. And perceived dependence reduces tension. Desire needs space, but not just any space. It needs the kind of space that doesn't feel like abandonment, nor like pursuit. The weak man doesn't know how to sustain that balance. He confuses silence with rejection, confuses distance with total disinterest, confuses neutrality with existential threat, and he reacts. Reacting isn't the problem. Reacting impulsively is. There's an almost mathematical pattern. Excessive male intensity after female withdrawal equals hierarchical inversion. Because the implicit message becomes clear. I need this more than you do. And whoever needs more, invests more. Whoever invests more, risks more. Whoever risks more, fears more. And whoever fears more, shows more. Shows anxiety, shows insecurity, shows that the silence worked. Calculated silence also serves another function, revealing self-sufficiency. When she reduces contact and continues living normally, she communicates that she doesn't depend on constant validation. If you can't do the same, the structural difference becomes obvious. This isn't about becoming cold. It's about not becoming predictably reactive. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote, "Men must either be benefited or destroyed, because if merely offended, they will take revenge." In modern relationships, this can be read differently. If you demonstrate that small emotional fluctuations already destabilize you, you are showing exactly where pressure can be applied. Silence is a form of light pressure, and light pressure already reveals a lot. The centered man notices the withdrawal, but doesn't shift his axis. He doesn't accelerate, doesn't beg, doesn't dramatize. He continues occupying his own space. That creates something rare, balanced unpredictability. Because now she also doesn't know how you'll respond. And when uncertainty is mutual, tension stays alive. Withdrawal also works as a filter. She observes, does he panic? Does he try to control? Does he accuse? Does he victimize himself? Or does he simply maintain presence without pursuit? Few pass this point. Because silence activates internal ghosts, fear of abandonment, fear of replacement, fear of not being enough. And men who haven't faced these fears react by trying to regain external control. But external control never compensates for internal fragility. Withdrawal doesn't create anxiety. It exposes pre-existing anxiety. If a few days of reduced contact are enough to disrupt your mood, productivity, and emotional stability, the problem was never distance, it was dependence. The final law is simple and brutal. Whoever can tolerate emptiness without chasing fills the space with value. Whoever runs to fill the void reveals scarcity, and perceived scarcity destroys magnetism. The final question isn't, is she playing games? The question is, why does her silence weigh so heavily on you? If someone's absence shakes your entire structure, maybe you never had a solid structure to begin with. And as long as her silence controls your internal state, you will keep reacting and calling it love. If you made it this far expecting a manual on how to win women, you heard wrong. These 4 laws aren't about them. They're about structure. Do women test? Yes. Do they fluctuate in validation? Yes. Do they reveal vulnerability? Yes. Do they use silence? Yes. But none of these strategies work where there's no exploitable weakness. The central point was never female manipulation. It was male instability. A structurally grounded man can feel, can engage, can desire, without losing his center. A weak man turns any external fluctuation into an internal earthquake, and that's where the game begins. There's no blame here. There's behavioral awareness. Relationships are invisible force fields. Whoever needs more concedes more. Whoever fears losing overinvests. Whoever overinvests reveals insecurity, and insecurity does not sustain deep respect. The final question is not, how do I prevent this from happening? The question is, could you handle losing access without losing your identity? Because as long as your identity depends on someone's approval, you will always be vulnerable to tests, silence, and fluctuations. Understanding this doesn't make you more romantic. It makes you less manipulable, and that comes at a cost. You start seeing patterns where you once saw chemistry. You start noticing strategy where you once saw fate. You start recognizing games where you once saw spontaneity. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now the question that keeps echoing is simple. Do you want love, or do you want position? Because in practice, you're almost always choosing one, even while saying you want the other. If you stayed until the end, it wasn't out of superficial curiosity. It was because some part of you recognized these patterns, maybe in an example, maybe in someone you're with now, maybe in yourself. I've studied human behavior for decades, and I can say one thing with uncomfortable honesty. Understanding dark psychology doesn't improve your life. It removes illusions. And illusions are comfortable. You start to notice when you're being tested. But you also notice when you're trying to manipulate. You notice when you're being conditioned. But you also notice when you're acting out of neediness. This kind of clarity isn't light. It's sharp. So thank you for not looking for fantasy here. If this unsettled you more than it should have, maybe it hit exactly where it needed to. Subscribe, not to become better, but to keep seeing what most people prefer to romanticize. Because in the next piece of content, the exposure will be even more direct. And the more you understand the invisible dynamics, the less you'll be able to pretend you're just falling in love.